There was a moment in that old Manhattan hallway when the father looked at his daughter and had nothing left to give her but the truth. Not money, not an explanation good enough to repair the years, not a check folded neatly inside an envelope, not a promise anyone in the room still trusted. Just the truth, standing there in a worn winter coat with empty pockets and hands that trembled from trying too long to look stronger than he was. Judith Sheindlin had seen fathers like him before. By then, she had already spent years inside the family court system, where the worst parts of a home came out under fluorescent lights. People arrived with broken marriages, frightened children, unpaid bills, addictions, lies, and stories they had polished until they sounded almost believable. But the hallway never lied. The courtroom was where people performed. The hallway was where they became themselves again. And that afternoon, after the hearing was over, after the papers had been gathered and the order had been spoken, Judy stepped out of the room and saw him standing there. He was not arguing anymore. He was not defending himself. He was not trying to look wounded. He simply stood near the wall, as though he had been asked to wait for a bus that would never come. His former wife was a few feet away, arms folded tightly across her chest, carrying years of grocery receipts, rent notices, school expenses, and resentment in the set of her jaw. Beside her was the daughter, not a child anymore, a grown woman now, old enough to understand numbers, old enough to understand abandonment, old enough to be angry in a way that had hardened around her heart. But that was not the whole story. The case had looked simple when it came across the bench. A father had failed to pay child support for years. There were arrears, there were missed dates, there were explanations that sounded thin. He had lost work, then lost another job, then stopped answering calls, then stopped appearing when he was supposed to appear. The former wife said he had always found money for cigarettes, for coffee, for excuses. She said their daughter had grown up learning not to expect him. The daughter did not cry at first. That was what Judy noticed. Anger often cried. Grief often cried. But a daughter who had waited too long sometimes did not. She stood with her chin slightly lifted, looking at her father as if she were afraid that one kind word from him might undo the life she had built without him. Judy had heard thousands of family stories by then, and she knew the dangerous ones were not always the loudest. Sometimes the dangerous ones were quiet. Quiet could mean shame. Quiet could mean cruelty. Quiet could mean a person had run out of lies. Quiet could mean there was something waiting underneath the paperwork. The father said little. He was older than his file made him seem. His coat was frayed at the sleeves. His shoes had been polished, but the soles told another story. When Judy asked where he was living, he gave an address too quickly, the way a man gives a line he has rehearsed. When she asked about work, he said he was looking. When she asked why he had not paid even a small amount, even $10, even something to show the court that he knew his obligations still existed, he looked down at his hands. That small silence changed the room. Judith Sheindlin was never sentimental about responsibility. Her father, Murray Blum, had raised her in Brooklyn with old-fashioned expectations. You said what you meant. You paid what you owed. You did not confuse hard times with permission to disappear. At the kitchen table, long before law school, long before the robe, long before America knew the glare, she had learned that excuses were easy, and character was what remained after excuses ran out. So she did what the law required. She named the debt. She made the order. She reminded him that being poor did not erase being a father. She reminded the daughter that the court could measure money, but not make a parent worthy. She reminded the former wife that bitterness, no matter how justified, could become a second prison if she let it live too long. But even as she spoke, she kept watching the old man's hands. They were empty. And still, somehow, they looked as if they had been holding something heavy for years. A man can arrive in court with empty hands and still be carrying the heaviest debt in the room. What happened next was the part that never would have fit neatly inside an order. The daughter had brought proof. She had brought her own memory, which in family court could be sharper than any document. She remembered birthdays with no phone call. She remembered her mother checking the mailbox. She remembered school forms where one parent signed and the other parent was only a name. She remembered deciding, somewhere around 12 years old, that waiting for him was a kind of foolishness she would not pass down to herself. Her mother remembered other things. She remembered overtime. She remembered choosing between a winter coat and the electric bill. She remembered being told by friends to move on and by relatives to stop expecting anything from a man who had already shown her who he was. Her anger had not arrived that day as a performance. It had been earned slowly, in small rooms, over small bills, across many years. Judy understood that kind of anger. Not because she excused everything it did, but because she had seen what years of carrying a family alone could do to a woman. In the 1970s and 1980s, when Judith Sheindlin walked through those courthouse corridors, women were often expected to be both soft enough to forgive and strong enough to survive. Mothers came into court exhausted. Grandmothers came in with children asleep against their coats. Girls came in looking older than they were. Strong women were praised only after they had no other choice. Still, the father's silence bothered her. Not because it made him innocent, it did not. Not because it erased the debt, it did not. But there was a difference between a man hiding from responsibility and a man hiding from humiliation. Judy had learned to recognize that difference, not with softness, but with experience. A practiced liar usually filled the room. Shame often made itself small. The former wife said he had not cared whether their daughter ate. The father flinched. It was the first honest movement Judy had seen from him. Then the daughter said something that made the hallway seem to narrow around them. She said a neighbor had once told her, years before, that a man had been seen standing outside her apartment building late at night. More than once. She said she had dismissed it at the time. She had told herself it was nothing. She had even been frightened by it. But recently, after learning her father had been living in shelters and sometimes sleeping on trains, she had begun to wonder. The old man closed his eyes. He did not deny it. And in that silence, the case changed, without changing at all. He had not paid. That remained true. He had not shown up when he should have. That remained true. He had left a child to feel unwanted. That remained true most of all. But on certain nights, when he had no room of his own, when pride had become too heavy to carry into their doorway, he had walked to the block where his daughter lived and looked up at the windows. If the kitchen light was on, he knew they were home. If the bedroom light went out, he imagined she was asleep. He told himself that knowing she was safe was something. It was not enough. It was not even close to enough. But to a man who had failed at every visible part of fatherhood, it became the only invisible thing he still knew how to do. Judy had no patience for men who confused watching with providing. She would not let him turn shame into nobility. That was not her way. She had seen too many children pay the price for an adult's private pain. Love that does not show up still leaves an empty chair. Concern that never knocks still leaves a child waiting at the door. But she also knew that families were rarely made of one clean truth. The daughter looked at him differently then. Not softer, not yet, but differently. Sometimes the first crack in anger is not forgiveness. Sometimes it is simply the unbearable discovery that the person who hurt you was smaller than the monster you needed him to be. Her mother saw it too, and that may have been the hardest part, because anger can hold a woman upright for years. It can keep the lights on. It can help her cross a cold street with a child's hand in hers. It can make her survive what tenderness might have made impossible. But once another truth enters the room, anger has to share space with grief, and grief is harder to control. The father finally spoke. His voice was low. He did not ask to be forgiven. That mattered. He did not say he had done his best. That would have been a lie. He said he had been ashamed. He said he had lost work, then lost his room, then lost the nerve to be seen by the daughter who used to run to him when she was small. He said he would stand across the street some nights because it was easier to be a shadow than to be a disappointment in the light. No one answered right away. Judy had spent a career refusing to let people hide inside pretty words. Yet even she knew that some confessions come out plain because there is nothing left to decorate them with. In that moment, the case was no longer just about child support. It was about the terrible poverty of silence. It was about the way a father can become a ghost while still alive. It was about a daughter who had grown up believing absence meant indifference, only to learn that sometimes absence meant cowardice, shame, and love too weak to act like love. And that was the difficult part. Weak love can still wound. Silent love can still starve a child. A heart full of regret does not buy shoes, does not pay rent, does not sit in the auditorium when a daughter looks into the crowd. Judy knew this. That was why her face did not soften too quickly. Compassion, in her courtroom, was never allowed to become permission. She had spent too many years watching adults ask children to understand what children should never have been asked to carry. So she told him the debt remained. She told him he would pay what he could, and he would report, and he would not vanish again. She told him that a father did not get credit for loving from across the street. She told him the law could not make him proud enough to knock on the door, but it could make sure his silence was no longer cost-free. Then she turned to the daughter, not as a television personality, not as the famous judge America would later invite into its living rooms every afternoon. Just Judith Sheindlin, a woman who had spent years watching children become adults before their time. She told her, carefully, that knowing the truth did not require forgiveness. She told her that anger may have protected her when she was young, but she should be careful not to let it become the only inheritance her father left behind. The daughter looked down. The father kept his eyes on the floor. The former wife wiped her cheek quickly, angrily, as if even that single tear had betrayed her. And Judy understood what no order could fix. Everyone in that hallway was owed something. Only some of those debts could be collected. Years later, after America knew the name Judge Judy, after the lace collar and the pearls and the sharp voice became part of afternoon television, people would think they understood what made Judith Sheindlin tough. They thought it was impatience. They thought it was temper. They thought it was the pleasure of catching people in lies. They saw the quick look, the raised eyebrow, the way she could cut through an excuse before it finished crossing a person's lips. They loved her for it. They laughed. They repeated her lines in kitchens and living rooms. They trusted her because she seemed immune to nonsense. But what America did not always see was the weight underneath that toughness. Before the studio lights, before the producers, before millions of viewers, there were hallways like that one. There were fathers with empty hands, mothers with tired eyes, children old enough to know they had been let down and young enough to still hope they were wrong. There were people who came to court asking the law to repair what love had broken. The law could do many things. It could order payment, it could set dates, it could warn, punish, record, compel, and remind. It could draw a line where chaos had taken over. Judy believed in that line. She believed in it fiercely. Without it, the loudest person in the family often won. Without it, the responsible parent carried everything. Without it, children learned that promises were optional. But the law could not give a daughter back the years she spent staring at an empty chair. The law could not turn a homeless man's shame into groceries. It could not turn a mother's resentment into rest. It could not make a late apology arrive on time. That was the truth she carried home. The robe came off at the end of every day. The cases never did. Maybe that is why she became so sharp. not because she felt nothing, but because she had seen what happened when feelings were allowed to excuse everything. Maybe that is why she demanded plain speech, because in family court, a lie could become a child's childhood. Maybe that is why she disliked excuses so deeply, because every excuse had a person waiting on the other side of it. And maybe, every now and then, she remembered the old father in the hallway. Not as a hero. He was not one. Not as a villain. Life had made him something sadder and more complicated than that. He was a man who owed money, owed presence, owed years, owed courage. He was also a man who had stood in the cold outside his daughter's building, because the only version of fatherhood he could still afford was watching a light go out and praying she was safe. That did not make him right. It made him human. And Judith Sheindlin, for all her famous hardness, understood the danger and necessity of seeing people whole. If you saw only his shame, you might forgive too much. If you saw only his failure, you might understand too little. The hard work was to see both and still make a decision. That was the work behind the glare. When she later sat on television and told people to take responsibility, older viewers heard authority. But many of them also heard something else. They heard a woman from Brooklyn who had watched mothers stretch dollars until the paper almost tore. They heard a woman who knew what divorce did to children. They heard a judge who had seen strong women go home alone and pretend not to be tired. They heard someone who understood that love without action was a story adults told themselves to sleep at night. The father with empty hands became one of those quiet cases that never needed a headline. No camera captured it, no audience applauded, no one turned it into a famous moment. It lived where so many family court memories lived, in the space between what was ordered and what was healed. Perhaps the daughter eventually let him speak. Perhaps she did not. Perhaps the mother never stopped resenting him. Or perhaps one Thanksgiving, years later, she passed him a plate without looking directly at him. Perhaps he paid slowly, imperfectly, in small amounts that came too late to change the past, but not too late to prove he had stopped running. Family stories rarely end as cleanly as court orders do, but the meaning of that afternoon stayed simple. A man can arrive in court with empty hands and still be carrying the heaviest debt in the room. Judith Sheindlin knew that debt had to be named. She knew it had to be paid. And she also knew that some debts, the deepest ones, are paid in the painful currency of truth. That is what people sometimes misunderstood about Judge Judy. The toughness was real. The impatience was real. The refusal to be fooled was real. But behind it was not a woman who hated weakness. Behind it was a woman who had spent too many years watching weakness hurt children. So she made people stand up straight. She made them answer. She made them stop hiding behind stories that sounded better than the truth. And every so often, in a quiet hallway after the hearing was over, she saw the thing the law could not quite touch. The empty hands, the unpaid years, the daughter still waiting for the father who had been too ashamed to knock, and the judge standing there in the cold light, knowing that justice was necessary, but love was the wound no order could fully close. If you believe the legacy of Judge Judy is not only in the rulings, but in the lives she forced to face the truth, subscribe to Beyond the Gavel for more untold chapters from the woman behind the robe.